now. So no cursing, and you have to be, very wonderful. Do we get to see you?
Hang on. I thought I was here. Come on.
Come on. You can be there. Can you see us?
I sure can, but for some reason.
There.
Here we go. Camera. Here we go. Open. Yes, standard. I'm here. Am I not here? I've been here.
Is that you're not here yet?
But my voice is here.
Your voice is there. Maybe I can do something from my end.
Hang on. Come on. I was.
Can you? Is my camera locked? No. Your camera is locked.
It's the first time I've done it from this one. I don't. Come on.
We'll get there.
Put camera. Come on. There. There.
There.
Hey.
We got you.
Great.
We have you.
Microphone's good.
Brilliant. I want to get rid of this participant setting. Let's turn it up. Astrid, we're just going to play around with maximum volume and getting this screen looking a bit better. Okay, that's better there. And am I at maximum volume? Astrid, can you sing a song or something fun?
Hello. La, la, la.
Can people hear Astrid enough? I
can talk about the weather. We finally in Melbourne got
lovely
weather. It's been so dry.
It's been so dry. Oh, it's the volume. Hang on, it's the volume on this shebang. Christine, you got any whiz bang? Astrid, in a minute you'll meet Christina, but we are.
Scene master is
so it's on there. It's on this screen. Is it? I think it's on. I'm not on this screen when we get to sound.
Patrick, I can try headphones and a microphone here, if it might help.
Now I'm going to put you onto the iPad and see if that's any better, but I don't think it will. Try now, Astrid. I've just thrown you to the iPad.
Okay, what's my voice like now?
Yeah, that's better. We like you better.
All right, fantastic.
That's preferable. And people, if you cannot hear Astrid, can you please move forward? I know I said I'll record it, but it's important you hear everything that Astrid's going to talk about. So come back row, come on up. Would be lovely. Astrid, I've given you a very small introduction, but not actually a lot, other than, you can fill me and correct me. Astrid is an architect, and she and I worked on a project about 25 years ago in a park, and we won a state award for lighting. Isn't that a nice highlight?
Yes, it is.
It is. Because I like to think it's because Astrid is very clever, and she's remained very clever, and she's now down at Swinburne University. And you could talk us through a couple of things there if you'd like to, but you are really the go-to expert for CPTED, and that's what we're going to talk to you about this morning. How's that?
Okay. All right. Hi, I'm Astrid, and I teach at Swinburne at undergrad. It's at an undergrad level design studio for interior architects, but the body of knowledge, CPTED, that I'm going to introduce today is, well, useful for all designers, but I think has a special place in landscape design as well. So I'm hoping that this body of knowledge is just quite useful to come into structure your thinking at this stage of your design process. So I think, Patrick, straight into the slides.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. I'm on this, aren't I? This is me. I was sitting down and relaxing. Astrid, so I've said it. Students in this room have got 2 more weeks on an analysis phase of their project, and then they've got about 6 weeks, 5-6 weeks on the design phase. So that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, but this is useful.
Yeah. I know this is very useful. So I will get us there. In 1
minute. Sorry. Oh, don't you love the hoops they make you jump through?
Oh my God, that's right. This is the Swinburne hoop. That's right. Who am I? I am. And then I think they're going to give me a code as we enter the world of Swinburne, which it did very quickly the other day, actually. Oh God, 5718235. Okay, I'm going to go to number 1.
Okay, fantastic. All right. And I'll just say next.
Yeah, lovely.
All right. So, I've got feedback. Yeah.
You've got feedback.
Hopefully you don't.
We don't have feedback here.
Okay. So CPTED is an acronym for crime prevention through environmental design. Next slide. There it is. Drawing from fields of criminology, psychology, and environmental psychology. Of course, intersect with design. So the next slide. So this is Psychology 101, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And in order to achieve, all human beings want to be according to Maslow's self-actualized. And this triangle, the reason for the triangle is you can't have the higher order of thinking without the lower. And what you can see is right at the bottom here is safety. So before we feel even love, we have to feel safe. Which you know, if you didn't know about this school, you'd think, oh, surely love, we're capable of feeling love. So what this relates to is after food, water, warmth, and shelter, the sense of safety is really important for anything that any transaction that we want to do in society. So in the design of public spaces, before we can connect people, before we can form bonds, before we can feel though we're in an occupied civic space, we actually have to feel safety is a precondition for actually everything in space. Next slide. So what I wanted to do, rather than using just words, because I know that in your project, Patrick briefly, and there's this large car park site, and a spider web with roads leading to it. I think that was the beetle image. But I wanted to just use this project as a precedent, and if I just show you images of the project, I'll explain most of the theory in relationship to this particular project, because it's a car park and it actually exemplifies a lot of theory that I'm talking about. So this project is by Yaya Architects, and it's actually a refurbishment of an existing car park. And yeah, so the CPTED theories that I'm going to talk about are maintenance, territoriality, surveillance, and activation, which will be useful ideas to get you thinking about what you might do under those categories. So next slide. So it was an existing car park in a port area, and done in 2016 in Copenhagen in Denmark. And basically on the rooftop of this garden, of this car park, they made a play space and basically a garden. So the children can play, and there are activities crucially for all ages. So it's a case of build it and they will come. So it was a very dilapidated car park, and maybe next slide, Patrick. And the whole car park got a facelift. So what you can see, so once it was sort of a bit grey, now with Core 10 steel, a complete facelift, a complete change of visual language, And very, very crucially, the instead of normally in a car park, you don't know what level is what, the wayfinding is poor, and normally whenever you go into a lift or a stairwell into a car park, it's a little bit terrifying because you've got no idea who's in there. Very crucially, they made the internal circulation of the building external, so that suddenly, the minute you emerge onto this staircase, you feel safe because, hey, everybody can see you, nothing can happen. Well, it could, but if you were to yell out, someone on the ground level would see you. But very importantly, if you're walking up and down this staircase, you can actually see, you are surveillancing, you are looking over a site. So it's this idea that safety actually comes from co-presence, that you see other people, they see you, and it's an upward spiral. In the same way that if no one sees you, there's a downward spiral. You feel less and less safe. Next slide, Patrick. There you can sort of see on the mural is some sort of a civic mural. So interesting, if you're going to put clues about a site's history and make references to the site's history, put it where people actually can come up close and actually interact with it. So there's sort of a mural, laser cut metal about the site history that you see up close as you walk down. Next slide, Patrick. And you can see that wherever possible, it's a car park, but wherever possible, these biophilic green elements have been inserted, and a very different materials palette to what you'd normally see in a port, all concrete, grey and drab. This is warm. Warm materials also make people feel safe. Next slide. So this is up on the rooftop, and maybe, oh no, this sort of shows, and instead of the rooftop just being barren and one open space, what they've actually done is divided that rooftop into a series of territories. We can sort of see that there's these discs demarcate different activities. So there's demarcation of zones, and yet maybe the next slide will just sort of leaf through them. You can sort of see the different activities there, sort of drone's eye view. We'll keep going to a human view. There's one activity, but what you can see is, here you can see that when you get up onto the rooftop, it's a Goldilocks condition, that you can, different activities are demarcated, yet you've got visual, what they call visual access. Your eye can access the whole site and you can see through. And this is kind of a difficult thing to achieve, this demarcation of zones, so that you don't feel like you're in an empty wasteland, and yet you can see, your eye can surveillance the whole site. Next slide.
Astrid, could you describe the Goldilocks condition? The Goldilocks condition?
Well, the Goldilocks condition is getting it just right. Remember, Mama Bear, Papa Bear, Baby Bear. You know, this is too big, this is too small, and this is just right. So, you know, the too big is no site demarcation. The other not right is you've divided up the site, but you can't see it. And the Goldilocks is that subdividing the site into zones, and yet you can surveillance the whole site. Does that make sense, Patrick?
Yep.
The Goldilocks.
I like it.
And that within even the zones, there are zones within zones. And what human beings like, and you can see this young woman seated in her little space, that she fully occupies this little niche. We like small niches off demarcated zones. So it's all about creating zones in a site and then zones within zones, because emptiness is something that we don't feel safe in. Okay, next slide. I think we've seen that, and that's right. And you even then have view to the port beyond. So they're all permeable, visually permeable barriers that are put in. So we've demarcated, and yet there's visual access. And there is that staircase, and you can clearly see who's going up and down that staircase. And next slide, there's the mural. Next slide. And also this idea that's sort of this expanded steel lattice, a real avoidance of bars, anything that we associate with prisons, you know. And so many car parks have got visual barriers that look like you're actually in a prison. So everything has been done here to not use the usual barrier language, because barrier is quite negative. I mean, we won't need barriers. We don't want to drive out of the car park and out, you know, fall onto the pavement, but it's a very negative language. So just to be clever, to subvert the usual visual language of a car park. Next slide.
That's great, Astrid, because we do have barriers in these car parks.
Well, and you need barriers, but how can a barrier not be a barrier? And in this case, the barrier now becomes a veil. Instead of a bar saying stop, it's a veil. It's a veil. And you still need, this veil is draped over the whole car park building, but within that, you still need that wayfinding. Where are you? And I don't have an interior of the car park, but yes, you need to know within the car park, where are you? But clearly, because you've got access to outside, the sunlight direction and all of those visual clues and cues of what is beyond are a navigational aid, rather than the really silly pink column, blue column, I don't know, the usual things that happen in car parks. Next slide. So now comes the theory, and I'm just going to relate it back to the car park. Are you hearing? Is the sound still okay, Patrick?
Yeah, I'd give it 7 out of 10, but it's bearable. Is it okay for everyone? Everyone at the back, everyone can hear? Yep, we're good.
Okay. So theory-wise, in CPTED theory, we've got the theory of maintenance. And it's this idea that if a window in a building is broken, and if it's just left unrepaired, soon all of the rest of the windows in the building will be broken. And it's this idea that subconsciously, if we see non-care on in a site anywhere, subconsciously it tells people, oh, look, they don't care. Why should I care? It almost becomes infectious. So what it means, Patrick, next slide, is that on this site, a materials palette is used that really speaks of care. It's a materials palette or a visual language that we don't associate with a cheap car park, but actually it's a warm colour, which perhaps we associate with residential. It's a very high quality palette of materials, and Corten steel wears very well. You know, it doesn't degrade. And also these biophilic elements also show care. So on your site, and this is what I ask, next slide, Patrick, my students to do, questions to ask yourself. So it's not only about preventing graffiti and providing surfaces that can be cleaned, it's more about demonstrating civic pride. So high quality finishes that really weather well. So not paint, but, you know, let's say Corten steel, beautiful timber, beautiful stone. It doesn't weather and it communicates care. So what sort of materials and finishes look like they belong to your chosen precinct, in your case, your site, and communicate that they're part of the area. Next slide. So what I ask students to do is on the site, walk around the site and document where have people thrown rubbish, because subconsciously, quite often, people just throw rubbish where they think, well, no one's watching, that's a problem, but also, well, no one cares about this, so I'm going to throw rubbish. It's a subconscious cue to non-care. Document wear and tear of surfaces, and even yourself, look at where does it look worn and torn and nobody cares and it's a bit outdated. I mean, you can make that visual assessments yourself. And I get my students to produce a heat map, which is using a code to show what is worn and torn, where is it non-care, where does rubbish accumulate. Next slide is just a heat map, just in case you didn't know. So there's sort of a code of red means, well, whatever your legend says. Lots of people are there, no rubbish, or no people there, high rubbish, no rubbish, high traffic, no traffic. But a heat map is a great analysis tool just to use to communicate where are people, where is rubbish, how does that overlap. Anyway, next slide. And tasks that we can do is, here I've said City of Darebin, is even look on the website of the council that you're working with, because they have a particular visual language. Who do they think they are? What visual language do you think communicates whatever that city council is trying to say about who they are? Next slide. So then the second principle is territoriality, which was brought about by Oscar Newman in the 1970s, who really asked himself, why did modernist town planning fail? And why in the 1970s people were beginning to demolish. This was they say modernism ended in the 1970s when this Pruitt-Igoe modernist housing development was demolished. Next slide. And he developed this idea of defensible space, which, next slide, relates to this idea that public spaces, you've got to feel a sense of ownership over them. And if you don't have ownership over them, people will graffiti them, they will be very unsafe. This was why these housing developments were demolished. But in particular, there were these, what they called sky streets. And it relates to that there wasn't a privacy gradient. You could come out of your little flat straight into this, and gangs roamed them, which is very, very different to a traditional street. And I'm hoping I got the slide order. Next slide. Where you can see here, there's a much softer edge between where people live and then front little yards meant that residents would be standing there surveillancing the street. So you need these soft edges between the buildings and the pavement so that people feel that they can linger there. Surveillance, there's a sense of ownership there, they can occupy these spaces, and that the streets feel safe. So what territoriality is about, next slide, and these are the questions to ask yourself, is spaces are safe when the inhabitants of a neighbourhood feel they have ownership or control over a space. So in your sites, no one's occupying a car park. Do you know what I mean? No one's sitting there going, wow, it's my wonderful car park. It's very different to if those buildings, those streets were surveillanced by actually a residential use. So it's this kind of idea, who's in the buildings looking over that particular street. And, this is an argument for mixed use sites, which is, I think, what your projects are actually going to tackle, because it's those mixed uses, not just a blank car park, that's actually going to make those streets feel safe. Next slide, Patrick. So for something to feel safe, it has to feel like a territory. And a territory, to be a territory, it's got to feel like a place. And you've got to stand in those streets and go, does it feel like a place, or does it feel just like the barrel of a gun. You're just in a street that has no character. So to change a characterless street into a place, you have to ask yourself, are public and private spaces demarcated? Does the space have edges, borders? Is it defined? Are there clear entry and exit points? Can you see all of these pointers are asking you to do very specific things to make a space feel like a place. And very importantly, the proportion. Does the space feel like a room or a corridor? So, think about a corridor. You don't linger in a corridor. You don't have breakfast in the corridor. You have breakfast in a kitchen or a dining room or a lounge room, which is a very different proportion of space to a corridor, which is a long, narrow space that you just pass through. And most of our streets and the streets feeding into your site will probably feel like spaces and not places. This is really important. Next slide. So this is a little bit of theory, and I'll talk a little bit about Christopher Alexander. And a number of authors wrote this book in the 1970s called A Pattern Language. And they asked themselves, why do some spaces work, spaces and buildings and built environments work, and why does modernism fail? And this book is basically a survey of, through history, of spaces and places that work. And they identified that there are patterns, through history and culture, there are patterns. There are certain things that work. And one of them is, and they called this the positive outdoor space. And we don't arrange spaces like this. This is a traditional village somewhere in Europe. It could be China. But can you see that they've arranged these houses in farmland, because farmland is precious, and they're clustered together so that the houses actually create what's called positive spaces, these courtyards between them. And we human beings like these courtyards or these enclosed spaces. And we silly people in Australia wouldn't do this. We just scatter our buildings over the site. And what that creates is the opposite of positive outdoor space. It creates negative spaces. Next slide. So you can see positive is enclosed space. Negative is just little buildings scattered over a site, or spaces not being defined. Next slide. So what we want to do is, where we don't feel defined spaces, we want to, or where there's negative space, which are these long corridor-like spaces, or open space can just be far too open and it's not defined, or a long, narrow corridor and it's not defined. And our fix is to divide that space through plantings, through materials, through built elements, into defined zones. So this is what makes people feel safe. Human scale defined zones. Next slide, Patrick. And to then provide off these zones, little pocket spaces. You can see a town square there, and then little pockets off the zones as well. Activity pockets. Next slide. So look, here's an example. Here's an intervention. It's a particular scale. They've changed. I think you step up into it, so the ground plane shifts up. It's a different colour to what is around it, but it's taking a site that had no scale, had no definition, and the typical drab grey concrete. And it's this idea of divide your site into smaller subzones, demarcate it through treatment of the ground plane, demarcate it through plantings as well. But demarcation is really important. Create a territory. that people feel that once you've created that territory, people will feel safe and they will linger. Whereas they're not going to linger, of course, on the pavement, the non-defined to either side of that defined territory. Okay, next presentation. Just goes on. This one is really important for landscape design, surveillance. So the principle of surveillance refers to what we call natural surveillance. So that's using our eyes, not mechanical or security camera surveillance, because sometimes people think, oh, the cure actually for making a site feel safer is to put in security cameras. And quite often it has the opposite effect, because people go, wow, this must be unsafe. Look at all the cameras. So mechanical cameras for surveillance doesn't necessarily make us feel safe. It's useful in certain contexts, but doesn't make us feel safe. What actually makes us safe, and this is back to the Yaya architect's car park, is the fact that these people on the stairs are looking at us, we're looking at them, and where it's co-presence, we're making each other feel safe. Next slide, Patrick. And all of this, safety in surveillance actually comes from what the design principles that make an English park. This is a classic park based on the English park. It's repeated. It's a typology. It's repeated around the world. Why does this feel safe? And here we have this Goldilocks condition again, where the site has been divided into a series of zones. Each of these trees, like a giant umbrella, creates its own zone. So it's not empty. It's populated by these trees. Each tree with its canopy creates a zone, and yet there is visual access all the way through. And here's this path. Oh, we know where we're going. And oh, generosity, here's the seat. When we're going somewhere and we feel a little bit tired, we can safely sit there. So this classic English park typology is driven by surveillance, the need to see, for the need to feel safe, that yes, there could be somebody hiding behind a tree, but by the time they jump out, there's a little bit of distance between you and them. And also if there was someone, a lion chasing you, I know this is ridiculous, you can hide behind the tree. It's this Goldilocks condition between empty and your visual access being barred that makes surveillance work. Next slide. So surveillance obviously works in plan, and it's useful to look at a hard drawing of your site and go, where are what we call blind corners? Where someone could be standing and they might leap out. How do you fix those blind corners? Do you know what I mean? In the top example, you'd move that entranceway forward, or with a corner, you might actually put something there so that someone can't stand there. There's always a cure for these blind spots. Identify where they are in your site and propose a remedy. And also, very importantly, next slide. Oh, this is this idea of co-presence. People don't like blind spots. They like to see where are we going, and that there are no blind spots. Next slide. And also surveillance happens in section. And this is really important for landscape design because in an English park, what's removed, you've got a ground plane, which is the grass, ground covers, anything up to about knee height. And then you have a clear canopy, and that canopy defines zones and, makes the park what it is, beautiful. But you've got to remove critically remove what they call the middle ground between 450 mil and about 400, basically so that you can see other humans within the site. Because by seeing other humans, you can read their faces, you can go, oh, these people friendly, are they not friendly, who are they? And other humans give us delight, we like to watch them, but they can also be a source of danger. You want to be able to read each other within the site. And you can only do that when you have visual access. And if you remember when I spoke about the roof of the car park, it was divided up. It wasn't a park, like the slide that I showed. It was all hard landscaping elements, but the same principle applies. The middle ground hasn't been blocked so that there's clear visual access through the park. Next slide. So what I get students to do are these analysis sections, analysing, cut a section through the car park, cut a section through the housing, cut a section particularly through those walkways. What can you see and who can see you? Next slide. So yes, this is pattern language again, and he's saying the same things that said. We have a look at, just flick through these slides, that open stairs, open walkways, which kind of makes a case for, with those heavy concrete walkways, to perhaps move the balustrade, make them open so that there's some sort of visual connection between people using the walkways and people actually on the street. Next slide. Open stairs, open walkways, street windows, creating mixed use in those car parks so that there's actually windows, street windows. You can see this very quaint little Parisian street, and some sort of a visual connection between two people. That's the kind of surveillance, intimate surveillance that you want. And that it's most important what happens on the ground, 1, 2, 3, maybe next slide, Patrick. Oh, here we go. And that, yes, a pedestrian street is something that's really important, that it has a certain scale and that it's a surveillanced street. Next slide. And here we go. And what we want to do is read people's faces. That's what, are they friend? Are they foe? Am I going to strike up a conversation with them? And maybe next slide, Patrick. And you can see that what's important is this connection between what's happening in buildings and what's happening below. Next slide. And you can see that it's in the first, second, third, and maybe fourth. You can sort of read and have a connection between what's going on. But once it's over the fourth story, there's no more visual connection occurring anymore, no meaningful vision connection. So what's happening on the ground, first, second, is absolutely crucial to a sense of safety to what's actually happening in the street. So that's where these walkways, different uses really, really matter and impact on a sense of safety. Next. And the last principle, CPTED principle, learning from a woman called Jane Jacobs, who was a theorist, is about site activation. And I might just, these are just from her very famous book. We'll just flick through the next couple of slides. So she wrote a very famous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Next slide. There it is, my very old cover copy of it. Next slide. It's an attack on modernist architecture. Next slide. And she said that to make a city feel safe, sidewalk is the American term, but basically a whole suburb will feel safe if the sidewalk is safe. If you don't feel safe walking down the street, then suddenly the whole suburb doesn't feel safe. So if you want a whole area to feel safe, you have to make the sidewalk or the pavement feel safe. Next slide. And so a safe street has to have all of these characteristics. And look, there's an overlap between this and Oscar Newman's territoriality, a clear demarcation between what is public and what is private. And this is what she's famous for. There have to be eyes on the street. So buildings have to be orientated or overlooking the street. That overlaps with the other theorists. And the sidewalk has to have people walking on it fairly continuously. So how do you achieve this? Next slide. So you've got to have mixed uses, and we've already spoken about that. It can't just be a car park. There's got to be something going on. And you have to have activities that draw people to the site. Next slide. So yeah, to Jane Jacobs, eyes on the street. We've got the idea that eyes on the street are crucial for a sense of safety. And what you've got to do in Brown is provide activities that draw people to your site and that encourage people to linger and inhabit the site. So, and we call that, in CPTED theory, the act of injecting activities a site activation. So what program, other than a car park, are you going to bring? And it could be as simple as seating somewhere to linger, table tennis, outdoor table. I mean, this is something that you'll discuss at PACTRED. Next slide. Jan Gehl comes in the 70s, later than Jane Jacobs, and he has the same aim, but his aim largely is to create these pedestrian zones devoid of cars, because his main idea is that you reanimate the public realm by taking cars, stopping the dominance of cars. And the cars have to go through. You can't remove them. That's how people get there. But it's to remove that visual dominance of cars that make people much more generous pedestrian zones that make people feel safe, because we feel safe when we see another pedestrian, maybe someone on a bike, but surveillance from a car is too fast. Even if we're on a site with cars, we don't feel safe. It's all about pedestrians on streets make us feel safe. Next slide. And it's also about softening that edge. You activate what he calls the urban edges by softening the edges between these very large buildings and then the pavement and the street. And when he talks about softening, these are cafes, it could be plantings, but it's basically whether they're hard elements or soft landscape elements, to put elements that have a human scale that soften this edge between building and street. Because if you don't soften that edge, you don't provide that human scale that makes people feel sheltered and safe and then linger there. Next slide. And Jan Gehl was very much into that you've got to create these promenades or pedestrian zones. Next slides, just we'll flick through. That these zones have to be comfortable. He calls it an invitation to stay. So you've got to have humans' needs are strolling, standing, sitting, observing, listening, talking. It's got to have a human scale, and good climatic conditions means great tree canopy that shelters people. Trees are great shelters. Next slide. So look at your site. Who currently use it? You know, what ages? You know, who are they? Profile them. I think you've started to do that. And how can the broader, so what can you put there that makes the people who come there already feel better? And also, what can you put there to draw people, you know, not in the current target range to the site, the broadest range of users actually to your site. Next slide. And so provide increased levels of comfort, shelter from the elements, whether it's a canopy, an architectural canopy or tree canopy. People need to be sheltered. Provide increased facilities, toilets, bike parks, seating, water fountains, and very importantly, provide programs. So some sort of uses that draw people to the site. In particular, consider programs that are used at night, because that's when we feel least safe. So here's where the outdoor cinema kind of idea comes in. Next slide. So also part of this is all of this as well is to provide wayfinding, that the streets create a journey. I've sort of slipped this in because it's part of surveillance, that people like to see where they're headed, but they want to understand where they're going. And part of a way of doing this, next slide, is to create, so this famous book by Kevin Lynch says that the city is made of paths, edges, districts, nodes, and landmarks, and we navigate where we go by creating clear paths, clear edges, clear landmarks, and that's how we orientate ourselves. Next slide. And we orientate ourselves, maybe next slide again. So you can sort of see in this, yes, by creating paths and goals. So this is a very, very clear path. This red element could be a seat, it's a shelter, it's a place to stop. Someone could busk under there, something could be exhibited there. But can you see this journey has been designed? This long, narrow path has been broken up into a series of zones. And I think that's what the previous slide was as well. We'll just go back to that previous slide. Oh, yeah, that one. Can you see here what could have been just a long, long path? This is one of my students' projects, has been broken up into a series of zones through the use of the trees, which mark out the journey of the way, but also these large green vertical elements as well. So it's not just, you're not just facing down the barrel of a gun. There's a series of zones. There's clear access through the path, through the site, but there are paths and goals. Flick through a couple, next to the next one. So here we go. Here's another pattern. Paths and goals and a promenade. This is really, really important. So to create a promenade, you've got to have a very clear path. You've got to see where you're going. And you can see that people love to watch each other. People love to watch other people. People like to see and be seen. People like to occupy these kinds of spaces at night. But to create a promenade, this comes back to activation. You've got to have activities that bring people there in the first place. And a promenade is like a necklace. It's got to have these jewels actually along it. Next slide. And here on the one example is the High Line project, where they're always, yes, it's a very, very linear park, but there are activities and different zones within us. And this is another one, the Parc de Promenade Plantée in Paris. And you can see it's not just a linear park. There's a clear path, but there are also beautiful episodes along this path. Next slide. This one is one in Melbourne, the St Kilda Promenade. And here again, the decking creates the clear path, but all along it, this decking changes to create shelter. In this case, it sort of broadens and creates this space where you can either sit and watch, or you could actually have a performance here. But the key is got to provide these activations along the path so that people move from activity to activity. And it's these activities or this activation that brings people to the site, brings eyes to the street. And that makes people safe. And if you've got a safe area, it's an upward spiral. Then the whole area, the sidewalk is safe. People perceive that particular precinct to be safe, and therefore the whole area to be safe. I think that's the end of that one. And so the past, what I've spoken about, that there are, and if Patrick gives you, I can give you the PDF copy of the slides, because the questions to ask yourself under each CPTED category are clues as to what you put in. But you can sort of see that the 4 principles relate to each other and enforce each other. But it's really about demarcation, human scale, what's happening in the buildings adjacent to footpaths, being mindful of the treatment of how you maybe separate car traffic, bike traffic, pedestrian traffic, so that everybody's safe, because you've got to privilege the pedestrian so that you've got that very important eyes, pedestrian eyes on the street. So that's the CPTED, and I'm just giving you a little bit more information, just that's relevant. Patrick and I were talking what's relevant actually to your site. And just about trees, your site has some very significant trees, those bunya pines. And if we just talk a little bit just go through that, those bunya pines, are really, really quite important, because they're important to Indigenous people as a food source. Those nuts, which actually if they fell out of the tree, would you've got to be careful. There are, when they ripen, actually they could kill somebody. So you've got to be a bit careful about them. But, Indigenous peoples would gather to feast on these bunya nuts. And is there some way that we can privilege the existing edible trees, or possibly even introduce other edible trees? Because there's this element of time and the experience of seasons is something that's really lacking in our modern lives. Just this connection to natural cycles of edible things being produced, in spring, or, coming out and blossom in spring, trees losing their leaves and there being a harvest, typically in autumn. But it's something that really enriches the urban experience. So can we make something of these bunya pine nuts? Can we introduce other edible foods that experience, or European, but can we reintroduce into our urban environments an experience of seasons via the production of edible fruits? Next slide. And the trees, these bunya trees, which are very, very stately, and I think you've got there's another tree. I've forgotten that one, but they are tree places. Big trees create tree places. And a pattern language talks about that in cities, that trees fulfill very, very important functions in cities. And to think of them as such, that they are umbrellas, they are outdoor rooms, they are gateways, they are squares or public spaces, they create avenues and groves. So, a tree isn't just a tree, but a tree actually is a very, very important urban artifact, actually. And don't underestimate the power of trees to actually shape the urban environment. So be very careful when you're placing them, what sort of space, and particularly gateways. Trees can announce that you're entering a precinct, but they fulfill a very, very specific function when you understand spatially the impacts that they have. Next slide. Yes, believe it or not, now I'm going to talk about car parks because I'm an architect. And Patrick has told me that you've got different groups. That one group, one lot of you have to keep the car park and refurbish it as is, and that Yaya car park is kind of a model for what can be done. Some of you will half demolish it, and some of you will totally demolish it. You know, so all of you are going to be playing around with the car park. And all that I wanted to mention, next slide, actually we'll go back to a cantilever. You have to all know what a cantilever is, but I might go back to this. What you've got to do, but I'll go back to the cantilever, Patrick, because everyone has to, it's an engineering term. You've got to just go on the site. No, go back to, oh no, forward, sorry.
Oh, thank you.
Forward, sorry, there we go. With concrete construction, and concrete being a composite of the cement and the steel, wherever you've got one of those sticking down beams, and I haven't seen a close-up of your car park, you can't remove those beams. So next slide. So when you're saying, oh, I'm going to demolish the car park, what you've got to do is walk onto the site, and you can only demolish bay by bay by bay. So you can't, so where those arrows are, that concrete is spanning from, you could remove that whole section. So the idea here is that you can remove the whole car park to a particular bay, to a structural grid. You've got to document where that structural grid is. And you can do that. You can sort of count how many structural bays are there. You can then count that on site and then put that on your site plan. So those of you who are doing a partial demolition, you can demolish basically up to a structural bay. And you can maybe also get a little bit creative. Who says you've got to demolish the whole building? Maybe you just put holes in it. Wow. And send up vegetation through this car park. Yes, you lose some cars, but you then get very, very good visual orientation in that car park. Were you to have shafts of light, and even if you demolish it, and you know, these courtyards, or this idea that you actually punctuate this vast slab of a building with shafts of light, would be very, very important. So if we just go back to a cantilever, you've kind of got to know what this is. A very sexy cantilever. A cantilever here in concrete is this giant beam is sticking out. It looks like it's hanging out in the air, but it's actually supported, because it is supported way back. The cantilever is the part that's just hanging out over the air. And I've included this idea of a cantilever because those of you who are stuck with refurbishing the car park, you might be able to cantilever something, you know, so over the existing car park, so that the car park is still humming away, but you might 2 meters, 3 meters, be able to cantilever a walkway, some sort of a pedestrian zone. I don't know what function you think of, but actually have something hanging out over that has better surveillance qualities than just a car park. So that's what a cantilever is. And we've just talked about concrete construction, that you've got to, there's different types of concrete construction, but essentially the columns tell you where the structural bays are, and you can only remove structural bays at a time, and you can possibly remove what is between the columns, but not the line going from column to column. Does that make sense, Patrick?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, so that there are rules about which bits you remove, but having said that, then there's a lot of play, and you can play around with existing structures. Next slide. A lot of you will be constructing green roofs. you know, which makes a lot of sense. They're expensive, green roofs, but they make a lot of sense in an urban configuration. You know what I mean? There's an economic argument for them to create extra green space in these denser areas. And I just wanted to just walk a little bit through. Next slide. All green roofs are kind of made of the same, have got the same elements. So, well, of course, as you would know, when a roof of a building is covered in vegetation and soil, it assists with the filtration of that stormwater, and it can be part of a water-sensitive urban design. Patrick, have you covered water-sensitive urban design?
Not specifically yet.
Yep, okay. I'll gloss over it.
Yeah, yeah.
But these green roofs, apart from being...
We have master's students here, so I'm almost assuming that everyone has probably covered water.
Oh, just do a hands up, because then I won't talk about it, you see.
Should we have a little talk about WSID? Yeah, you're getting nods. I say go.
Yeah, okay. See, we don't have to do it.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Anyway, but a green roof can be
we got
part...
a nod to do it.
Oh, to do it.
Yes, correct.
Okay, all right, then I will do it. And Patrick then will elaborate.
Talk about it more, correct.
That's right. Okay. So here's my, because you know this is my water sensitive urban design, not for landscapes. So it's water sensitive urban design 101 for actually interiors, and they've got no clue at all. So a green roof can be part of a water sensitive urban design strategy because, of course, there will be biofiltration there just because of the green matter that you've put there. A green roof also can be part of a wildlife corridor strategy in an urban environment because those bees, those insects, those bats, those birds, I don't know, maybe possums, your green roof will be some sort of refuge that might connect, you know, the movement of this wildlife from one green park to another. And your green roof might be some critical piece of wildlife corridor that connects one green space actually to another. So that green feature, that green roof is also does something wonderful for the surrounding environment because up there on that roof, it will be cooler. It will help with the overall urban heat sink. So, you know, urban areas with all of their grey concrete, dark bitumen are heat sinks. They are far too hot in summer. And we basically want to put as much green canopy area and green area as we can because wherever we put green, plants transpire, and through the transpiration, through actually there's a local drop in temperature through their process of with the chlorophyll in their leaves. Basically, their metabolisms, what they give off is water. They actually evaporate water, and wherever you have evaporation, you have a localized drop in temperature. So plants have a used on mass have an effect of the environment of dropping the temperatures in summer and of modifying temperatures. So in winter, they, you know, trees break up winter winds, you know, they're helpful, but in summer, they help with the urban heat sink. And big areas of green roof are really, really helpful in combating urban heat sink. Next slide. So all green roofs have got these same layers. You've got your plants at top. You've got some sort of a layer of mulch. You've got a growing media, which I say is minimum 300 up to 700, because it depends how big the plants are, the plant layer. Are you growing just ground covers or do you have small trees? And of course, an irrigation system there in that tree. And then you've got a layer of geotextile that stops the tree roots going down, because what do tree roots, plant roots do? They're looking for water and you don't want them to go down, because if they go down, they will destroy, number 6, the waterproof membrane that's protecting the building, and then you have a problem, a multi-million-dollar problem. So this geotextile allows water through, but stops tree roots going through. And then you've got a drainage layer, because without the drainage layer, your green roof will very quickly turn into a swimming pool. So you want the water to come down, drain off to the sides. And then 6, you've got your waterproof membrane, which has to be protected from the UV, but it's got all these layers above it. Next slide. So with climate change, you've now got something called a blue-green roof. And there the idea is that the drainage layer is like a reservoir. Look, engineers design this. You've just got to know what's a green roof and what's a blue roof. But a blue roof is a climate change strategy, because with the sudden downpours that we now have, you've got these rain and you've got these rain events, and too much water suddenly floods onto the street. So there, it's half a swimming pool. You've got sort of a very big drainage area. You know, you'd make it then maybe 400 millimeters fat. And there, the idea is that your green roof withholds the water slightly before discharging it onto the street, so that you don't have all the storm water hitting the street all at the same time. Next slide. So there's a blue roof, and you would have no idea that it's a blue roof. It's exactly the same as a green roof. And the only difference is that it's fatter, because it has a reservoir layer. And of course, it would be heavier because you've got a design for that water. But it's just that you're aware, green roofs are really, really neat, but we're also beginning to talk about blue-green roofs, meaning it's part of a stormwater strategy to withhold a little bit of water so that it slowly leaks out, instead of this catastrophic mass stormwater event. Okay, next slide. I'm talking a little bit about green walls, because you have to be aware that not all green walls are green, meaning I've got to talk about that. Next slide. So the beautiful green walls that were popularized by Patrick Blanc, and he's a clever man. He actually has said, my green walls are not green, means they're not very ecological. These vertical walls, beautiful as they are, with their pockets of growing media, with very, very complex watering systems behind them, can fail catastrophically. And you can see sort of a very unhappy building owner up the top there with his failed green wall. And this is a multi-million-dollar failure. And in the very, very harsh Australian sun, do you know what I mean? With our temperatures, these poor little plants in their teeny weeny little pockets can snuff it. A electrical failure, if you have a electricity failure, so that the irrigation system that feeds these little plants fails, you'll have very rapid failures in Australian summers. So where it's used inside, inside Singapore airport, tick, climate control, etc., etc. But you as landscapers have to be a little bit smarter, because there's sort of something dumb about a green wall, because really this irrigation system is actually a man-made system mimicking what happens in nature. In nature, next slide, we have, of course, climbing plants and trees, and there you don't have an irrigation system, because the irrigation system, or the ways through which nutrient and water is circulated, is in the plant itself. So I tell my students, green walls aren't green. Come on, be a bit smart. design beautiful cascading creepers or climbing creeper systems that are just as lush as the Patrick Blanc walls, but this is green. So because instead of mimicking nature, you're using nature, and the plant itself has its own nutrient moisture distribution system. So here's a beautiful series of hanging baskets, beautiful. And there's a hanging pot up there. So, you've got a bigger, it's less prone to failure because basically you've got a much larger blob of growing media for the root mass. It's not going to fail catastrophically. Or, next slide. Here we go. Isn't that absolutely beautiful by Edward Francois and Duncan Lewis? Use plants, and work with nature rather than imitating nature with these sort of weird man-made systems. Okay, so that was my spiel on green walls. Design them working with nature. Next slide. I think I've got a little bit about water-sensitive urban design. So here is the Yarra in Melbourne. In Sydney, I'm sure you've got many waterways like this, and you have this water-sensitive urban design is a response to pollution, both seen and unseen, because this is what the eye sees, but with pesticide use or fertilizers in farmland areas, and mainly a lot of the toxins that come off the streets, our tires on streets. Oh yeah, we can go to the next here. Yes, next slide. This is better. And yeah, that's right. We have such pollution of our natural waterways. So water-sensitive urban design is about capturing, treating and reusing stormwater on site to improve the quality and quantity of water, stormwater entering our waterways. We don't need the blah. Next slide. So I prefer pictures rather than text. So on the left, in nature, what happens is that clouds form, rain happens, and because in natural environments you've got trees, they break the fall of water. So large droplets become small droplets. So those smaller droplets of rain infiltrate the soil, they go down into the root zone, down into the groundwater, and the water that finally makes it into the stream has been cleaned by its progress through kilometres, sometimes hundreds of kilometres of progress through root zones, mycorrhizal fungi, all the soil biota. So everything, the roots and all the living organisms of the soil basically clean the soil before it makes its way back into the stream. So over on the right-hand side, we've got what happens, our problem, what happens in urban systems. So that same cloud falls, there's no beautiful tree canopy to break up those large droplets. Those large droplets of rain are very, very heavy. They hit concrete, they hit bitumen, they hit hard surfaces. So there's very little infiltration down into the groundwater. So the water that then makes it into our natural streams contains all the bird poo, all the dog poo, all the tires, all of the oil from cars, these are petrochemical toxins, all the rubbish, all of the pollutants seen and not seen end up in the waterway. Next slide. So what water-sensitive urban design, and this is a diagram, this is clearly not to scale. The idea is we've still got these bad urban environments with all of their hard surfaces. But what we can do as landscape designers is insert miniature wetlands that mimic what happens in nature. So in these miniature wetlands, we have the plants, we have the plant roots, we have the organisms that basically where creating a natural biofiltration effect through these miniature wetlands before that same water then enters the stormwater system to go into our natural waterways. So from a landscape perspective, and that's what Patrick can elaborate on, these miniature wetlands, you know, our blue roof is like a miniature wetland. Green roofs provide biofiltration, but they can be landscape elements such as rain gardens, swales. They can operate at many different scales, but basically the more, the better, because the bigger it is, the greater the biofiltration effect. The longer the water stays in there and is filtered, is also the better. So the more of these miniature wetland elements that you can introduce into your landscape, the better the biofiltration or water sensitive urban design effect that you're going to create. I think that's it. I think that's the last slide. Oh, here we go. Here's just a few examples. So, you know, instead of medium strip trees dying, how clever is this? If you look at the design of the curb, it dips down, so any water rushing along the curb dribbles into this depression. The pavement is also angled to sort of slightly dip into this depression, and in this depression, you've got various trees. You've also got coarse gravel as well, so that you've got, you know, the water doesn't pond there. It's not a swimming pool. It quickly goes down, but the tree roots clean that water before it enters the stormwater system. But they're also not going to be drought stressed in summer because there's always water in there. So it's a win-win for the trees. It's a win-win for the urban waterways. Here's sort of another infiltration trench. I think this sits between two levels of car parking. You can see it's just planted, but it's the same principle, you know. There's quick infiltration, it's porous, it's not a swimming pool, the water goes down, but once it's at the root zone, in the root zone, it is cleaned before it enters the stormwater. Next. Everywhere there should be these aren't particularly pretty, but all of the surfaces that you have, you should be porous, so that you have infiltration into the ground. It's one big mistake of our urban environments. Next. There we go. Other examples. Porous paving. Next. Oh, I think that was it for water sensitive urban design. This is one last slide. You're going to be working on these car park buildings. There's a network of streets, and we've spoken about CPTED principles to enhance the safety of those streets. But also overall with your projects, the whole precinct has to have what we call visual legibility, meaning whatever you do to the car park, that car park will become a landscape node. It'll be, you know, it'll be something beautiful, not just a faceless car park, but also the bus stops and the train stations and the bus stations surrounding your site should have some sort of a visual presence so that people feel, oh, you know, you're navigating, this is paths and nodes. I'm going from where I arrive by train to your site. You know, we orientate ourselves through these paths and goals, and train stations should be these goals. These they should have presence. And I've just shown you these examples of train stations having quite significant, or bus stations, canopies. We really love these canopies, which can be hard elements, or they can be trees, or they can be some sort of a hybrid of both a canopy and a tree. And we love, in CPTED, we love these canopies because you achieve a presence overhead that doesn't actually provide there's no barrier that's actually blocking your visual access. So that was just a little bonbon, a little side. There we are, Patrick. That's me done.
That's lovely. Thank you, Astrid. Whilst we've got you, I'm going to bring you back on the screen. Are there any questions from the room at all? There you are. Any questions, anyone? Astrid,
There's normally not. Takes a while to.
I'm only going to take one question, then we'll get you out of here.
Okay.
The current struggle, I suppose, in urban life is biodiversity and the promotion of it, and that seems to collide exactly with that CPTED of that clearing the middle ground, and
Right.
the constant need to look for, let's use the same term, the middle ground of canopy or small birds, etc., travel in. Got any thoughts? In any good examples where that has been maintained safe?
Well, what I would say is that middle ground, which ecologists love. Do you know what I mean? Because that middle ground is ecological niche territory. So I'm not saying you take it out everywhere, but that middle ground becomes, let's say you have shrubs, you have dense shrubs of the knee height to, let's say, 2-3 meter, those habitat shrubs, they then become barriers because they then become walls that define your outdoor rooms. Does this make sense, Patrick? So it's not that you don't have them, it's just that you use them knowingly and judiciously. Does that make sense?
Good spatial understanding, Astrid.
There you are. So they are there because, see, what you're wanting is, and that's the image of the park. You're wanting that clear visual access. You're wanting to see, but whether it's a hard barrier with a green wall, because a green wall can have natives and habitat creeping up it, or whether it's hard, whether it's a whole zone of shrubbery, no one's going to be standing in the shrubbery. It's sort of solid. That, do you know what I mean? That's safe. And you'll find that subconsciously people walk away from areas where they don't have that visual access. That's why if you chart where do people leave rubbish, where are their blind spots, you'll quite often, if you watch people go on the site, they all walk where they have that visual access. So it's not that you can't have that habitat, but the habitat then becomes the walls, inverted commas, walls that defines these outdoor rooms.
Beautiful. And I'm sorry, last question. Got any comments on lighting in conjunction with, again, that same?
Oh, we didn't do that this year. Oh, but by now you know about it, Patrick.
I know, totally. But if you've got a quick one-liner, we can talk more about it through the term.
Oh, you know what? No, I'm not going to do a quick liner. Okay. They'll be swamped. I'll just send you. No, you just use a few images of that.
That's all right.
So in CPTED terms, okay, from a CPTED point of view, lighting is very important because it is at night time that people's sense of safety is most diminished. Having said that, more lighting, like a big wash of cold lighting, like that you're in a football field, will not make you feel safe. People like warm lighting. So it's this love of warmth rather than coldness. And what's probably better in landscape terms is to very clearly demarcate a path. So to have what we call task lighting, really light up where you want people to walk at night time, where you want them to sit. That's what's most important. And to have warm lighting. And so to have lots of little spots of lighting rather than a big beam of lighting is what people prefer. So that's from CPTED terms, but you have to, I like that, the bubble. But what you have to do is make sure that making people feel comfortable doesn't make nocturnal animals uncomfortable. So this is this interspecies design So people like lighting, it makes them feel safe, civic pride, etc., etc. But you've got to be careful to avoid light pollution. And light pollution is far too much lighting going up into the air that actually confuses bats, moths, birds, insects at night time because they think it's the moon, they gravitate towards it, and you mess with their circadian rhythms. And once again, the take home there is that the colder your lighting, the more it messes with the natural world, because cold equals daylight equals blue, whereas warm lighting is more of the sunset. So you're not confusing. So you're not telling bats and birds that it's in the middle of the day. You're telling them that it's sunset, which is less damaging than telling their little systems that it's in the middle of the day. So blue spectrum cold lighting really messes with the circadian rhythms of the natural world. Warm has far less impact, and really avoid senseless washing of buildings and of sending light upwards. Far better to have the ground plane clearly demarcated so humans could know where they're going, they understand the site, and small down lighting, occasional small up lighting of canopy of trees, but that big washing, football ground washing of sites, yeah, is visual light pollution. There we are, Patrick.
Beautiful, lovely, nice. In 2 minutes, I reckon. Well
Okay.
done. Let's give Astrid a clap and a thank you. Astrid, thank you.
Thank you.
Giving us a lot to discuss. I will let you go. Terrific. Thanks ever so much.
Okay, and just send us a text in or a chat in the break.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay, fantastic.